The winter wind that moved through Harlem that year did not simply carry cold, it carried memory. It slipped between brownstones and beneath doorways, brushing against the ankles of men who had learned to walk carefully in a world that measured their worth before they spoke a word. Harlem in the 1930s was alive in a way no other neighborhood in America could quite understand. It pulsed with poetry, brass, laughter, defiance, and an undercurrent of watchfulness. Every storefront held ambition. Every jazz note carried history. And beneath the rhythm, there was a quiet awareness that power did not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wore a smile. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than most. By the time this particular winter arrived, he had already seen enough of the world to know that control was rarely loud. It was subtle, deliberate, and often disguised as opportunity. He had built his reputation not through spectacle, but through calculation. Where others relied on intimidation, he relied on observation. Where others raised their voices, he lowered his. Harlem respected him not because he demanded it, but because he never begged for it. He carried himself like a man who knew his own value, and that alone unsettled those who did not. The tension began quietly, as it always did. A new promoter from downtown had taken interest in Harlem's growing music scene. He was polished, well-dressed, charming in the way men become when they believe money can erase boundaries. His name was Victor Langley, and he arrived with promises of expansion and national exposure. He spoke about taking Harlem's finest musicians to larger stages, to grander rooms filled with society's elite. On the surface, it sounded like progress. But beneath the surface, there was something colder. His contracts were written in language that twisted ownership. His percentages favored his pockets. His compliments felt rehearsed. Duke Ellington had been approached first. Victor's proposal glittered with potential national tours, recordings, endorsements. But there was a clause buried deep in the agreement that would quietly strip Duke of creative control. The music would be filtered, softened, adjusted to fit mainstream taste. In other words, it would no longer be his. Duke, dignified and deliberate, did not sign. He asked for time. And when Victor left the meeting, smiling as though victory were inevitable, Duke sent word to Bumpy. Bumpy received the message without visible reaction. He had heard of Victor before. A man who prided himself on discovering talent, though the talent often existed long before he arrived. A man who believed Harlem was an orchard ready to be harvested. Bumpy did not object to ambition. He objected to exploitation, dressed as generosity. And as he stood by the window of his office, watching the streets below with thoughtful eyes, he sensed that this would not remain a simple business disagreement. It would become something larger. The meeting between Bumpy and Victor took place at a small cafe off Lenox Avenue. The cafe was modest, warm with the scent of coffee and conversation. Victor arrived precisely on time, removing his gloves with an air of a practiced civility. He extended his hand. Bumpy accepted it without hesitation. The handshake was firm, balanced. Neither man blinked first. They sat. Victor spoke first, his tone measured and persuasive. He framed his intentions as partnership. He described Harlem as a gold mine of untapped brilliance. He assured Bumpy that he admired the culture, respected the artistry, wanted only to help elevate it. But elevation, as he described it, required compromise. Polish, he called it. Adjustment. Accessibility. He suggested that certain elements of the music were too raw for broader audiences. Bumpy listened without interruption. He stirred his coffee once, slowly. When Victor finished, there was a pause long enough to feel deliberate, but not long enough to be rude. Bumpy leaned back slightly, folding his hands. His voice, when it came, was calm and even. "Harlem doesn't need polishing," he said softly. "It needs respect." Victor's smile thinned. He shifted in his chair, sensing resistance but mistaking it for negotiation. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, as though sharing a secret. "Respect," he replied, "comes with visibility. And visibility costs money." It was a subtle assertion of leverage. A reminder that access to larger platforms often required gatekeepers. Bumpy did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed silence to stretch between them, not uncomfortably but purposefully. Silence he knew had weight. Finally he spoke. "Visibility without dignity," he said, "is just a spotlight." His gaze held steady. "And spotlights can burn." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The conversation ended cordially on the surface, but beneath the courtesy, battle lines had formed. Victor left the cafe understanding that Harlem would not be handed over easily. Bumpy remained seated for several minutes after, watching the steam rise from his cup. He was not angry, he was attentive. And attention, in moments like these, was far more powerful than outrage. Over the following weeks, Victor began applying pressure in quieter ways. Venues that relied on downtown partnerships found their contracts delayed. Musicians who expressed interest in touring were told there might not be future opportunities if they declined Victor's terms. It was not overt coercion. It was economic tightening. The kind that squeezes slowly. Word spread. Anxiety crept into conversations backstage and inside dressing rooms. Young artists, hungry for recognition, felt the weight of the choice before them. Take the deal and risk losing their voice, or refuse and risk disappearing. The injustice was not loud enough to draw headlines, but it was sharp enough to cut. Bumpy moved carefully. He met with club owners, with band leaders, with community organizers. He did not threaten, he reminded. He reminded them of Harlem's resilience, of the power that came from unity. He encouraged collaboration among musicians so no one would feel isolated. He began organizing independent showcases funded quietly through local businesses, ensuring that artists had stages not controlled by Victor's influence. The turning point came on a Saturday night at the Savoy Ballroom. Victor had arranged to attend, confident that pressure would eventually break resistance. The ballroom shimmered with anticipation, packed with patrons dressed in their finest. The orchestra prepared to play, and whispers moved through the crowd like electricity. Would Duke sign? Would the others follow? Would Harlem bend? Victor stood near the bar, surveying the room with calculated patience. He expected deference. He expected compliance. What he did not expect was the announcement that came from the stage. Duke stepped forward, his presence commanding not through volume but through grace. He thanked the audience for their unwavering support. He spoke of creativity, of ownership, of the importance of preserving the soul of the music. And then he announced a new initiative, an independent touring collective formed by Harlem's leading musicians, supported entirely by local investment. No external control, no diluted arrangements. Full creative authority. The crowd erupted not with chaos but with pride. It was not merely applause for a performance. It was affirmation of autonomy. Victor's face remained composed, but the calculation behind his eyes shifted rapidly. He understood immediately what had happened. Bumpy had not attacked him. He had not confronted him publicly. Instead, he had quietly built an alternative. As the music began, powerful and unapologetic, Bumpy stood at the edge of the dance floor, observing. He did not smile broadly. He did not seek acknowledgement. He simply watched as Harlem celebrated itself. The injustice that had threatened to undermine its artistry had been answered not with aggression, but with organization. Victor approached. Bumpy near the end of the evening. The music swelled behind them, brass shining beneath the lights. Victor's voice was controlled, but the edge was gone. "You've made your point," he said. Bumpy's response was steady. "No," he replied gently. "Harlem made it." There was no triumph in his tone, only certainty. Victor studied him for a long moment, recognizing that this was not a man who could be cornered through pressure. This was a man who understood that real power was collective, and collective power could not be bought cheaply. When the night ended, patrons spilled into the streets with laughter and renewed confidence. Musicians embraced backstage, not because they had defeated someone, but because they had preserved something: dignity, ownership, identity. Bumpy walked home beneath the glow of street lamps, hands in his coat pockets, expression thoughtful. He knew this would not be the last challenge. Power rarely surrendered permanently. But for now, Harlem had refused to bow. And that refusal had been delivered not through violence, not through spectacle, but through strategy. In the quiet of his apartment, Bumpy paused by the window, listening to distant music drifting through the night air. He understood that resilience was not loud, it was consistent, it was patient. It was built in small decisions made daily. And tonight, those decisions had echoed across the neighborhood like a promise. Harlem would not be polished into something unrecognizable. It would shine on its own terms. Spring did not arrive gently that year. It came with tension woven into its warmth, as though even the sunlight hesitated before settling onto the brownstones of Harlem. After the Savoy night, after the collective refused to surrender its music, something shifted downtown. Men who had once dismissed Harlem as a colorful backdrop now understood it possessed something far more dangerous than rhythm. It possessed unity. And unity, when organized quietly, unsettled men accustomed to controlling outcomes. Victor Langley did not disappear after his embarrassment. He adapted. That was the nature of men who believed influence was a currency that could be reinvested. He returned to his office downtown, surrounded by polished mahogany and framed contracts from artists who had signed away their voices for fame. He studied Harlem the way investors study land before acquisition. If he could not buy its leaders outright, perhaps he could fracture them, divide the collective, tempt the young, isolate the bold. And so he began again, this time not with contracts placed in front of Duke Ellington, but with invitations extended to those without Duke's experience. Young band leaders, emerging singers, pianists whose rent depended on every weekend booking. The offers were quieter, more selective, and intentionally secretive. "Don't tell anyone yet," his assistants would whisper. "This is exclusive." Harlem felt the tremor before it understood the source. Whispers moved through rehearsal rooms. One trumpet player stopped attending collective meetings. A vocalist canceled 2 independent showcases with vague excuses. Anxiety crept into conversations, once filled with confidence. Victor had learned something from his earlier defeat. He no longer tried to conquer Harlem in public. He attempted to erode it in private. Bumpy noticed the shift almost immediately. He had long ago trained himself to observe patterns: who walked with hesitation, who avoided eye contact, who spoke too quickly when asked simple questions. Harlem was not merely streets and storefronts to him. It was a living organism. When one limb trembled, the whole body felt it. He did not summon anyone angrily. He did not accuse. Instead, he began visiting rehearsals unannounced, sitting quietly in the back with hands folded, listening not only to music but to the mood. Musicians who had once laughed easily now glanced toward doors between songs. A drummer whose rhythm had always been confident faltered slightly when certain topics arose. Fear was entering the room. Not fear of violence, but fear of scarcity. Scarcity was Victor's new weapon. One evening, a young saxophonist named Elijah Carter found himself standing outside Bumpy's office long after sunset. He was talented, extraordinary, even but barely 22, and supporting his widowed mother. Victor had offered him a solo touring contract, separate from the collective, promising radio exposure and significant pay. Was signed exclusively, leaving Harlem's independent initiative behind. Elijah knocked softly. Bumpy opened the door himself. He did not ask why the young man had come. The room was dimly lit, the city's hum drifting faintly through the window. Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he explained the offer, the money, the pressure. He spoke quickly, guilt tangled with desperation. "It's not that I don't believe in what we built," he said. "It's just, I don't know how long." "I can wait." Bumpy listened without interruption. When Elijah finished, silence filled the room, not judgment, not disappointment, just thoughtfulness. Finally, Bumpy rose and walked toward the window, gazing down at the street below. "Do you know," he began softly, "why men like Victor are patient?" He turned back, eyes steady. "Because they believe hunger always wins." Elijah swallowed hard. "But hunger," Bumpy continued, "can be managed. Pride cannot." He did not tell Elijah what to do. He did not demand loyalty. Instead, he asked one question. "If you sign that contract, will you still recognize your own sound?" The question lingered heavier than any warning. Elijah left that night without a decision, but with clarity growing in his chest. Victor, meanwhile, sensed resistance hardening again. And so he escalated. He arranged for a downtown newspaper to publish a piece questioning the financial stability of Harlem's independent collective. The article framed the initiative as romantic but unrealistic, suggesting that without established investors, the musicians would eventually fail. It praised Victor's visionary guidance, while subtly casting doubt on Harlem's self-sufficiency. The article spread like smoke. Club owners worried about long-term bookings. The collective's confidence, so solid weeks before, now felt tested under scrutiny. "Can feel official even when it is calculated." Bumpy read the article twice without visible emotion. On his desk. If Harlem could be convinced it was fragile, it might behave as though it were. The next evening, Bumpy called a private meeting, not with the musicians alone, but with local business owners, church leaders. Bumpy stood at the center, hands clasped behind his back. "They're testing our patience," he said calmly. "Not our strength." He outlined Victor's tactics without anger. He explained how fear could create cracks where none existed. He did not present himself as a savior. Instead, he asked each person in the room what Harlem meant to them, not. The answers came slowly at first, then with conviction. A shop owner spoke of his father opening the store during harder times. A choir director described music as survival. An elderly woman, her voice trembling slightly, said, "This neighborhood is the first place that ever called me home." The room shifted. By the end of the meeting, commitments had formed, not dramatic pledges, but practical ones. Patrons committed to advance ticket purchases to ensure steady cash flow. Harlem would not depend on downtown validation. It would fortify itself. Victor heard of the meeting within days. He arranged one final maneuver, a lavish gala downtown, inviting select Harlem artists individually, promising them personal recognition separate from the collective. He believed ego would do what hunger had not. The invitations were embossed, elegant, impossible to ignore. On the night of the gala, limousines lined the curb outside the grand ballroom. Inside, chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors. Victor stood at the entrance, greeting guests with rehearsed warmth. He expected at least a handful of Harlem's rising stars to appear. One by one, the invited musicians declined. Some sent polite notes. Elijah Carter, after nights of wrestling with doubt, mailed back his unsigned contract with a single sentence written across the front. "My sound belongs where my roots are." Victor waited longer than he cared to admit. The ballroom filled, but not with the faces he sought. Eventually he understood. The fractures he had attempted to create had instead revealed the depth of Harlem's foundation. Later that evening, as music drifted through Lenox Avenue from an independent showcase more vibrant than ever, Victor stood alone in his grand ballroom, applause echoing hollowly around him. Brass soared, drums thundered, voices rose unapologetically. Bumpy stood near. The entrance, watching patrons flood inside, laughter and pride intertwined. Duke Ellington approached him briefly, eyes reflecting both relief and admiration. "You knew they wouldn't break," Duke said softly. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "I knew they'd remember." The turning point had not come through confrontation, nor through force. It had come through reminder of identity, of belonging, of collective strength. Victor's wealth had met something it could not calculate, community bound by dignity. As the final song of the evening swelled, the crowd fell into a moment of reverent silence before erupting into applause. Not because they had defeated a man, but because they had defended themselves without losing who they were. Outside, beneath the warm Harlem night, Bumpy paused once more, listening to the echo of music spilling into the street. He understood the battles would continue. Power rarely concedes permanently. But tonight, Harlem had proven something far more enduring than financial independence. It had proven that unity, when rooted in respect, cannot be bought. Summer arrived heavy that year, pressing down on Harlem with a heat that seemed to magnify every whisper, every glance, every unfinished sentence. The music still flowed from club windows and brownstone stoops, but beneath the rhythm there was a new undercurrent, quieter than fear, sharper than doubt. It was the sound of retaliation, forming out of sight. Victor Langley had withdrawn publicly after his failed gala, but men like him did not accept humiliation as final. They recalculated. They sought alliances beyond the spotlight. And in certain downtown offices where contracts were drafted and permits were approved, his voice still carried weight. The first sign came without warning. One Tuesday afternoon, city inspectors arrived unannounced at 3 Harlem venues, clipboards in hand, expressions neutral, authority unquestioned. They measured stage platforms, examined wiring, cited minor infractions that had never before been urgent. By evening 2, clubs had been ordered to suspend operations pending review. No accusations, no arrests. Just paperwork. The following day, a rehearsal space owned by a longtime church partner was notified that its zoning classification was under reconsideration. The timing was not subtle. It was surgical. Harlem felt the air tighten. Musicians gathered in anxious clusters outside shuttered doors. Club owners flipped through inspection reports with trembling fingers. A singer who had just secured her first headline night stared at a notice taped across the entrance of the venue, her reflection faint in the glass beside the printed seal of authority. Victor did not need to be visible for his presence to be felt. Bumpy received the news in fragments throughout the afternoon. He did not respond immediately. He walked Lenox Avenue slowly, observing faces, noting posture. Panic was the true objective here, not the closures. Panic fractured judgment. Panic encouraged desperation. By evening, a meeting had already formed. Inside a modest back room above a bakery on 132nd Street. The room was small, warm from the ovens below, crowded with musicians, venue owners, and community leaders. The air buzzed with anger barely restrained. "They're choking us," one club owner said sharply. "This isn't coincidence." "We should march downtown," a young trumpet player insisted. "Let them see we're not afraid." Others spoke at once, frustration building into volume. Bumpy stood near the doorway, silent, listening. He allowed the storm of voices to rise fully before he moved forward. When he did speak, his tone was low, steady, and deliberate enough to draw every eye toward him without command. "They want noise," he said simply. The room quieted. "They want us." "To shout," he continued. "To look reckless, to look unstable." He paused, letting the weight of the observation settle. "If we do that, we make their story easier to print." The anger in the room shifted, not extinguished but redirected. Bumpy walked to the center, table where inspection notices lay scattered. He picked one up and read it carefully. Electrical spacing, exit signage placement, Minor technicalities elevated into emergencies. "This is pressure," he said calmly. "Pressure tests foundations." "And what if the foundation cracks?" someone asked quietly. Bumpy's gaze moved across the room, resting briefly on Elijah Carter, who stood near the back, jaw tight, but eyes attentive. "Then we reinforce it," Bumpy replied. The following days unfolded like a chess match played in silence. While Victor's allies expected chaos, Harlem responded with precision. Volunteer electricians and carpenters appeared at closed venues before sunrise, correcting every cited violation. Lawyers quietly supportive, but rarely seen reviewed municipal codes line by line. Churches hosted temporary performances so musicians could continue earning. Every obstacle became a coordinated effort. Victor watched from downtown, waiting for visible cracks. Instead, he saw resilience strengthening. Frustration grew sharper. And then came the deeper cut. A rumor surfaced in the press, subtle, insidious, framed as speculation. It questioned the financial transparency of Harlem's independent touring collective. It suggested mismanagement of funds, hinted at internal disputes, implied instability. No direct accusations. Just doubt planted where trust had been carefully cultivated. The article spread faster than the inspections had. Doubt printed in black ink carries an authority even when it lacks evidence. Patrons began asking questions. Investors hesitated. Evening, Duke Ellington found Bumpy seated alone inside a dim club that had reopened only hours earlier. The stage lights were off. Chairs sat empty. Duke closed the door gently behind him. "This isn't about permits anymore," Duke said quietly. Bumpy nodded once. "No, they're trying to stain what we built." Bumpy leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the darkened stage. "Stains don't spread without moisture," he said. "We keep it dry." Duke studied him carefully. "How?" Bumpy stood, walking slowly toward the piano resting under a sheet of protective cloth. He removed the cloth gently, revealing polished wood beneath. "We invite them in." Duke frowned slightly. "Invite who?" "Everyone," Bumpy replied. "Press, patrons, critics, accountants. We open every ledger, every contract, every expense, in daylight." The idea settled heavily between them. Transparency was not weakness. It was defiance. Within 48 hours, Harlem announced a public forum at the Savoy Ballroom. No performance, no spectacle, just information. Books would be opened, questions answered. No hostility, no accusation. Victor learned of the event. Quickly, he had expected anger. Instead, he saw confidence. The gala he once hosted downtown had been built on exclusivity. This gathering would be built on openness. The night of the forum, the Savoy filled beyond capacity. Journalists sat near the front, notebooks ready. Community members lined the walls. Musicians stood shoulder to shoulder behind. Duke and the collective's treasurer at a long wooden table. Bumpy did not sit at the table. He stood off to the side, observing. Duke began with calm dignity, explaining the formation of the collective, its funding structure, its expenses, its tour plans. Every ledger was projected onto a large board behind them. Questions were invited, not filtered, not pre-screened. Hard questions came first. Are you solvent? Yes. Who audits your books? A local firm stepped forward to confirm independent review. Have any members left due to financial disputes? Elijah Carter spoke then, voice steady. No. There was no grandstanding, no emotional speeches. Just facts. By the end of the evening, the tension that had hovered over Harlem for weeks began to dissolve. Applause rose, not triumphant, but relieved. Trust, once threatened, had been fortified through courage rather than confrontation. Victor read the follow-up article the next morning with tight lips. The headline was simple. Harlem Collective opens books, silences doubt. No scandal. No fracture. His strategy had been exposed not through accusation, But through integrity, that afternoon, he made one final attempt. He requested a private meeting with Bumpy. They met once again in the same modest cafe off Lenox Avenue where their first conversation had unfolded months earlier. Victor appeared composed but thinner somehow, as though the strain of repeated failure had etched faint lines along his confidence. "You've made this personal," Victor said, though his tone suggested uncertainty rather than accusation. Bumpy stirred his coffee once before replying. "You did," he corrected gently. Victor leaned forward. "You think this ends here?" Bumpy met his gaze without hostility. "It ends when you understand something. And what's that?" Bumpy's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it, now quiet, unshakable. "Harlem isn't yours to fix." The words did not land as threat. They landed as truth. Victor held his gaze for a long moment, searching for leverage, for weakness, for a crack. He found none. What he faced was not a man driven by ego, nor one fueled by revenge. He faced someone anchored in purpose. Outside, the summer sun moved across the pavement, casting long shadows down Lenox Avenue. Life continued. Children played near stoops. A saxophone practiced somewhere in the distance. The neighborhood breathed. Victor rose from the table slowly. "You've protected them well," he said. Bumpy shook his head faintly. "They protected themselves." When Victor stepped out into the sunlight, there was no dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle. Only the quiet understanding that certain battles cannot be won with money alone. That evening, music returned fully to Harlem streets, not strained, not defensive, but confident. The collective's tour dates filled quickly. Club doors reopened permanently. The rumors faded into irrelevance, and as night settled gently over the neighborhood, Bumpy stood once more near a lit stage, watching Duke's fingers glide across piano keys with renewed brilliance. He felt no triumph, only fulfillment, because the greatest victories are not those that silence enemies. They are those that preserve identity. And Harlem, tested by pressure and rumor and quiet sabotage, had emerged stronger, not louder, not angrier, but unbroken. Autumn arrived with a different kind of quiet, not the tense quiet of uncertainty, not the cautious quiet of watchfulness, but the deep, reflective quiet that follows endurance. Harlem had survived pressure, rumor, inspection, doubt. The collective had grown stronger, the venue steadier, the music fuller. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm had passed, but storms do not always announce their final wave. Victor Langley had not returned publicly since his last meeting with Bumpy. His name faded from conversation, replaced by bookings, rehearsals, new tour dates. The collective prepared for its most ambitious event, yet a grand outdoor concert on 135th Street, a celebration of Harlem's independent success. No velvet ropes, no private guest lists, just music for the neighborhood that built it. It was more than a performance. It was a statement. And statements, even peaceful ones, can threaten those who prefer narratives of dependency. 3 days before the concert, a city permit complication emerged. It was small at first, an issue with crowd capacity classification. Then it grew, a public safety review. Additional requirements, temporary barriers that would limit attendance. The message was clear: scale it down or risk cancellation. Collective gathered again, this time inside the Savoy's dim backstage corridor. Anxiety returned, but it was different now. Not desperate, not fractured, focused. Elijah spoke first. "They're trying to shrink us." A club owner added quietly, "If we reduce capacity, it changes the meaning." Duke stood near the stage curtain, thoughtful, hands folded. "If we cancel, they win," he said softly. All eyes turned toward Bumpy. He had not spoken since the meeting began. He leaned against a wooden support beam, expression unreadable. Finally, he straightened. "Who signed off on the original permit?" He asked calmly. "The city commissioner's office," someone replied. And the review? Came from the same place. Bumpy nodded once. Then we don't argue with paper, he said. We speak to the man holding the pen. The room quieted. The commissioner, Thomas Caldwell, was known for his polished demeanor and careful neutrality. He was not publicly aligned with Victor, but influence often traveled through invisible corridors. Caldwell prided himself on appearing fair, even while navigating pressures from wealthier districts. The meeting was arranged for the following morning. Bumpy arrived precisely on time at the municipal building downtown, dressed impeccably, posture relaxed but deliberate. He entered Caldwell's office without entourage, without raised voice, without visible urgency. The commissioner gestured for him to sit. Caldwell began with formalities. Mr. Johnson, we simply want to ensure public safety. Large gatherings require careful oversight. Bumpy nodded politely. Of course, he did not accuse. He did not reference Victor. Instead, he placed a folded sheet of paper on the desk. Between them, it contained a list not of grievances, but of compliance measures already met. Fire marshals consulted, barriers secured, emergency routes mapped, volunteer medics assigned, everything required and more. Caldwell scanned the list slowly. You've been thorough, he admitted. Bumpy's voice remained steady. We learned from the last time paperwork was used against us. Caldwell looked up sharply. There was no hostility in Bumpy's expression, only quiet awareness. We're not asking for special treatment, Bumpy continued. Only consistency. Silence filled the office. The ticking of a clock became suddenly noticeable. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. There's concern, he said carefully. From certain investors, they believe events like this create unpredictability. Bumpy met his gaze without blinking. Music isn't unpredictable, he replied softly. Fear is. The words settled heavily. For a long moment, Caldwell studied the man before him, not a protester, not a threat, not a headline. A leader. Composed, controlled, unapologetic in dignity. What exactly are you asking? Caldwell finally said. Bumpy's answer was simple. Let Harlem celebrate itself. No speeches, no demands. Just a request framed in fairness. Caldwell exhaled slowly, fingers tapping once against the desk. Then he reached for his pen. The permit stands as originally approved, he said quietly. There was no dramatic handshake. No triumphant grin. Bumpy inclined his head slightly. Thank you. As he stepped back into the city street, autumn air crisp against his face, he did not smile widely. He simply adjusted his coat collar and began the walk back uptown. The night of the concert arrived beneath a sky brushed with deep amber and fading blue. 135th Street transformed into a living river of anticipation. Families arrived with folding chairs. Shopkeepers closed early to attend. Musicians tuned instruments backstage beneath temporary lighting strung across rooftops. There were no barricades limiting attendance. The crowd stretched farther than anyone expected. Duke stepped onto the stage first, greeted not by polite applause but by a roar that felt like years of resilience released at once. He lifted his hands gently, and the noise softened into attentive silence. The first note he played floated into the open air, unfiltered, unapologetic. Music spilled across Harlem like sunlight after rain. Elijah's saxophone followed, rich and confident. Drums rolled steady as heartbeat. Voices rose in harmony. The street became a cathedral of sound. Bumpy stood near the edge of the crowd, partially in shadow, watching faces. Children perched on shoulders. Elders closed their eyes as melodies carried memory. Business owners stood beside artists, no longer separated by fear of inspection or rumor. And then, unexpectedly, Caldwell himself appeared near the back of the crowd. He did not arrive with ceremony. He stood quietly listening. Perhaps he had expected chaos. Perhaps he had expected disorder. Instead, he witnessed discipline within celebration, neighbors guiding one another, volunteers directing foot traffic. Medics stationed calmly. He witnessed pride. As the final piece began, a soaring arrangement written specifically for this night, the crowd fell into a stillness so profound it felt sacred. The music swelled, layered with brass and strings and percussion that seemed to speak not just to ears, but to history. And in that stillness, Harlem stood tall. No one bowed. No one asked permission to exist. When the final note faded, silence lingered for a heartbeat before the applause erupted, thunderous, unified, unstoppable. Caldwell remained where he stood, expression thoughtful. He had not been threatened. He had not been pressured. He had been shown. Victor Langley, watching from a distance he did not admit publicly, understood something he had resisted for months. Influence built on control can be revoked. Influence built on respect cannot. As the crowd slowly dispersed beneath street lamps flickering to life, Duke approached Bumpy once more. "This was bigger than music," Duke said quietly. Bumpy's gaze moved across the street, now littered only with confetti and fading echoes. "It always was," he replied. There were no fireworks, no declarations of victory. Only the steady rhythm of a neighborhood that had refused to shrink. Later that night, as Harlem settled into sleep, Bumpy stood once more by his window. The city beyond was restless as always, but something within it had shifted permanently. Not because a man had been defeated, but because a community had proven it could not be diminished. Power had tested Harlem 4 times through contracts, inspections, rumors, and permits. And 4 times, Harlem had answered not with chaos, but with composure. The music still drifted faintly through the night air. And this time, it carried something deeper than melody. It carried dignity restored. It carried unity preserved. It carried the unmistakable sound of a neighborhood that finally understood it did not need permission to shine.